of the things that's really unique about jiu-jitsu is this idea that I can push you. I mean, I can really, really push you just like you can push me to the edge of really like, my gosh, like he has his hooks in and he has me in a rear naked choke. And if I don't tap, right, he absolutely has the ability to kill me.
Here we go. Hey, folks, welcome to another episode of the Hard to Kill podcast. I am chatting with Dr. Gino Collura today. He's a behavioral scientist with a keen expertise in trauma, combative stress, and human resilience. He published something really interesting that made me really compelled to chat with him here today. He had a 2018 publication called Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, a tool for veteran reassimilation. He's been pulled, I guess, in the direction of helping veterans for a long while. He has a pretty cool backstory, kind of Jack Ryan-ish. So good timing because season 3's out and I'm just crushing episodes every night. So I'm sure we'll get into that. So Gino, thanks so much for reaching out and having a chat with me before the new year and chatting with me on the podcast and sharing your knowledge with the community. So Gino, man, welcome to the podcast. And let's start with, I guess, your cool background, and then we'll get into your research.
Oh man, that is awesome. So it's a real pleasure to be here, Dave. I love what you're doing in the community, the positive movement, the lives that are being influenced for greater potential and what that looks like for their life. It's needed, right? So massive 2 thumbs up. That's really, really awesome. So my story is a pretty unique one. It's a little eclectic, very unorthodox for sure to how it is I got to where I am now. So I was born and raised in Tampa, Florida, and got exposed to trauma for the first time, like real trauma, when I was in 3rd grade. My aunt was shot in the face in front of me, driving myself and my 2 cousins home from school. So the condensed version, 14-year-old kid took dad's hunting rifle, thought it would be a good idea to shoot at cars going down the road, and she took one round to the face. So she's still here with us today. Everything, is okay. But you can imagine being 8 years old, witnessing that and kind of what that does to you, right? And how it just embeds a whole different take on the realities of life and how precious and how fragile, right, this thing is. So fast forward, I got into martial arts. It was kind of a thing that my parents did to help me cope. Because look, man, I was 8, right? I was filled with anger and fear and not understanding, right? So judo actually was a pivotal thing for me growing up as a kid. And then that kind of graduated into boxing and then Filipino martial arts and Brazilian jiu-jitsu. So fast forward through there, in college, at that point, I had really grown an affinity for martial arts and for combative training in general. Got into firearms as well, and started working some security gigs as a bouncer, right? So, I mean, nothing crazy, just the door guy, that sort of a thing. And, that in of itself just brought its own scuffles. Tampa has a small city within the perimeter of Tampa called Ybor City, which is really known for its nightlife. And it's like a mini version of Bourbon Street, if you can imagine that. So lots of action there, right? So I got exposed to other levels of trauma, right? Being involved in that kind of a profession as well. And then that graduated into me getting into executive protection. So I went to EP school down in Miami, and that later dovetailed into me going and doing some pretty cool stuff, pretty legit stuff with Blackwater. They have the training facility up in Moyac, North Carolina, and I went through their high-risk security operations course, which is how to teach guys and gals how to deal with non-permissive environments, right, from an EP perspective and a ptsd perspective. So all that to be said, I spent about 3.5 years in Colombia, South America, specifically Cartagena, and did EP work. And for anyone who has done it, I mean, I think the majority of folks know, like, it's not the cool, fancy, flashy stuff that a lot of people think it is, right? It's pretty monotonous work, and especially if you're not doing something that is DoD related or federal government. When it's on the corporate side, it's a lot of hand holding and babysitting, and more than anything, a lot of logistics and planning, right? So, but it was a wonderful experience, and it opened the door for me to meet guys who are in Colombian special operations. And there's a unit there called La Jungla, which means the jungle, which they are commandos that go into coca fields, right, where the raw cocaine plants, coca plants are grown that they later churn and refine into cocaine. And they burn them down, right? And they also go after narcotraficantes and guerrilla groups and very high speed guys. A lot of seventh group special forces type folks are down there working as technical advisors and trainers and that sort of thing on our end of the house. So had a great opportunity to befriend a few of them, and man, their interpretation of trauma, right, and how it is that they maintained operational tempo was very, very different than anything I had ever seen with counterparts that were in the U.S. military. And the biggest thing was how they viewed embodying and dealing with trauma. It was a spiritual experience for them, right? It wasn't
Mm.
this idea of clinically, right? If you look at from an operant conditioning perspective, when we train, if you take a look at what the U.S. military did, the shift right between circular targets to silhouette targets, there's a very real reason for that, right? As far as it being able to condition the reticular activating system and what you're looking for when you're getting sight picture side alignment and you're getting ready to engage a threat.
Sorry, Gino.
So,
I just want
yeah,
to interrupt you there. Operant conditioning. Can we just get a brief definition of what that is, and then we'll carry on.
absolutely. So if you take a look, so there was a classical psychologist by the name of B.F. Skinner, and he came up with this idea of operant conditioning, right? So essentially what it is if you take a rat, you put him in a cage, right? And you give some sort of stimulus to create a response, you do that enough, it becomes habitual. It becomes something that is just second nature because there's this concept called Hebb's rule, right? What Hebb's rule says is neurons that fire together, wire together, right? So if every single time I know I am in a condition red, right? Or if I know like there's threats that I need to be ready to engage and I see that silhouette pop up, it triggers, right, that immediate response and what I need to do versus a circular target that doesn't look like a human being. There's a gap there, right? And so if you look at some of the numbers, especially going back to the Vietnam War, um, it was to the effect of about 30 to 40% of active engagement that took place. Most soldiers didn't even take a shot, right? As soon as they came up, they froze. Right. And that's something that not a lot of people like to talk about, but that's the truth. Right. And so, or the accuracy, right. There were not accurate hits and accurate shots. So that was something that they said, okay, so clinically we need to do something about that. But when you look at classical Western psychology, as wonderful as it is, there's also certain elements that it loses, right, or it forgets from a cultural perspective that are very, very important, right? So going back to the Colombian side of things for them, so it's a Catholic nation, right? And I can't say that it's a blanket statement for every single person in their armed forces and how it is that they deal with trauma. But the guys that I worked with, for them, this is how it worked. So they would go and they would, rock and roll on a mission, and they would come back, and every Sunday, without fail, they would go to confession. And for them, the process of having a ritual where every single week I go to an institution and all this stuff, all the loss, all the pain, all the trauma that I'm feeling, I believe in what it is that I'm about to do as far as confessing, and I'm getting rid of it. I'm handing it over, right, to something much more powerful and bigger than I am, and I'm absolved of it. I got to keep it moving, right? Because as you can imagine, Dave, right, like having to operate in your backyard, in your own country, day in, day out, as opposed to being dislocated from your home and you're on a 10, 12-month deployment. And that is what you do. Like you are eating, breathing, being deployed, right? As compared to, no, like I'm going to run and do this raid. And then I've got some training exercises in the afternoon. And then I'm at home having dinner with my wife and my
Right.
kids, right? It's a different mentality. It's a different shift. But the resiliency factor of these guys and how they could do this week after week, month after month, year after year, and just maintain that resilience, it fascinated me. It really did. It fascinated me. So, spent about 3.5 years in country, came back to the States, took about a year off to kind of cool out and go through my own reassimilation process. And started my doctorate degree at the University of South Florida in what's called neuroanthropology. So it's
Mm.
neuroscience mixed with medical and cultural anthropology. And I really wanted to hone in on the cultural element, right? Because the creation of belief systems, right? And how it is that we self-regulate and the interpretation of stress and trauma. So I spent 7 years completing my doctorate degree. Within those 7 years, I spent a lot of time with folks in the special operations community and took a deep dive in how it is that activities that were physical, mental, and social, like jujitsu, help with the reassimilation and identity management and reacculturation process.
That's fascinating. Because you're putting the, I guess the research behind what I've recently felt and what I've observed over the last few years amongst my friends in the veteran community. And so that's why it was so easy to kind of bring you on here and want to hear about how this research that you've conducted literally benefits the veteran in its, if you look at the veteran or the veteran community as a whole, specifically with healing from trauma, and the reasons thereof. So I guess we'll start with why do you think, or what did your research conclude, or can we say conclude? Can we what was it able to show with respects to BJJ and the veteran coming home from war and like their outcomes?
So bear with me, man, because this is going to be a loaded one. um,
No doubt, man. No doubt.
so,
We start with the hard
so
points
here,
first. Get them out of the way.
yeah,
Then
let's
we'll
do it, man. Let's get after it. Why not? Why not? Um, so here's the thing about it, right? So when you break down the complexity of martial arts, right? So like at a 40,000 foot view umbrella, there's so much variation, right? I mean, you've got like, your old school karate and taekwondo and tang sudo and you Wing Chun kung fu, all this stuff that's out there. And something happened in the 90s, right? As far as a lot of, I don't want to call it myths, right? But things being dispelled about efficacy and what was
Mm.
effective in a one-on-one empty hand combat situation where it is just two people, there are no weapons, you're not on concrete, and you are in this thing called an octagon, and it's just one man trying to impose his will on another. And the world got kind of taken by storm by Hoist Gracie, right? And
Yeah.
what it is that he was able to do in the first few UFCs, right? And that fascinated me. Like, so me having a background in judo, like I thought, like, oh, I understand grappling, like I get it, right? And love judo to death, right? And as far as standing on your feet and being able to toss somebody with the weight of the earth, hitting them afterwards is awesome, right? But what the Gracies were able to do with what they call Kosen judo and translate it more into something that is, listen, I don't care how you get the guy to the ground, just get him to the ground. And then once we're there, we're going to submit him as opposed to pinning, right? So judo has submissions, but it's notorious for throws, pins, right? And they have their time and their place, but jiu-jitsu takes it a step further, right? As far as let's finish it, right? What does it take to finish it? And, man, it really highlighted the importance of technique and timing, right? And how to stay super calm, right? When like someone's trying to rip your arm off or strangle you, breathe through it, right? There's always a way out, right? But man, it sounds like, okay, that's easy, but it's not. it's really not.
Dude, that was this morning. That was this morning for me. I had some young buck, and he was trying to rip my freaking head off, man. My jaw is still sore, and I was just like, man.
Yeah, dude.
But one thing I did learn, because I did some of the combatives work with the military, especially we just so many chokes. It was just like days and days. It felt like of just chokes, and getting out of the because the first few times you get a choke applied, you freak out, man. It's like, I can't breathe. Oh shit,
Without
I
a
can't
doubt.
breathe.
Yeah,
Or it's like, I
absolutely.
feel the blood draining from my brain. Okay,
Yeah.
what in that split second, like, what are you going to do to not panic? And
Exactly.
I really appreciate that because I can not panic in these situations because I had that conditioning years ago, like a decade ago. Whereas I think somebody coming in fresh, it might be really super stressful. So on that topic of stress, like, and I'd love to talk about the Gracies too. Like, I mean, just the first time I ever saw just, he's on his back, and I'm like, because I was watching like pride fighting and those things back.
Yeah.
What's this guy doing? Why is he on his back? Like, these guys are going to kick his ass. They're going to stomp all over him. And it was just like just a kind of a touch on that point that, yeah, they revolutionized things, and now we're seeing kind of that evolution, because it became like the dominant martial art on the
Mm.
ground as opposed to
Yes.
everything else. Because back in the day, like those fights were wild. There's like, I love these. There's like karate against taekwondo, wrestling
Yeah,
against,
yeah,
like,
yeah,
you
yeah.
didn't know what you were
Those are
going to get.
classics, man. Those are classics.
I love watching them on the internet because that brings me back
Yeah,
to like high school era, like,
for
when we like
sure.
first kind of like you want to talk like mixed martial arts was just the
Yeah.
Wild West.
Yes.
I guess so to bring back to jujitsu and like
Yeah.
the whole idea of like it kind of dominating the fighting space because it's
Hmm.
practically very effective. So
Yes.
then now apply to the veteran space, like how did that evolution kind of
Yeah.
start to happen?
So, and just from a context perspective, so that, talking about the other martial arts and just how broad stroke martial arts in general are, and then kind of siphoning down specifically to jiu-jitsu and kind of why it kind of took storm. So there's a pop culture element, right? What happened in the UFC? Obviously, the Army was watching, and so was the Marine Corps. And you look at the U.S. Army Combatives program as well as the Marine Corps martial arts program, and it's at the current version is heavy jiu-jitsu. Like there's a
Mm.
lot of which it changed and it switched quite a bit, right?
Oh, really?
From the early 2000s to now, there's been quite an evolution in what they teach and the different levels involved and associated with it. But I say all that to say, because of that, the way in which that we engage in the activity, the exchange, right, that is jujitsu, that is the gentle art, we are able to go 100%. Right? Not recommended, but you can. You can go 100% controlled. Everything that I got, right? And everything that you got. And we're two titans colliding. And at the end of the day, I can get up and shake your hand and say, thanks, bro. That was great. Right. And then on to the next one and I can go home. I'm going to be sore. Right. It's not going to feel
Yeah.
great. Right. But at the same token, there's something very powerful about that. You can't do that in most martial arts. If I were to go 100% in the boxing ring, right, and you and I were to get after it and you crack me and you knock me out and you break my jaw, that's a problem, right? Like that's
Mm-hmm.
that's not
Mm-hmm.
going to be conducive to being able to blend into to my civilian role, going to work the next day and what's involved there. So one of the things that's really unique about jujitsu is this idea that I can push you. I mean, I can really, really push you just like you can push me to the edge of really like, my gosh, like he has his hooks in and he has me in a rear naked choke. And if I don't tap, right, he absolutely has the ability to kill me. Right. Like, and not that you would because you're in the confines of a training institution, but look, a blood choke, yeah, you'll go out, but you hold it long enough, you absolutely can kill somebody, right? I mean, it doesn't happen often, right? Because we're a sport, but
Yep.
the reality of it is that it could, right? So, the thing about that is you have such, and I don't know, have you ever read the book On Killing by
Oh,
Lieutenant
of
Colonel
course.
Dave Grossman?
I had him on the podcast.
Okay.
Yeah, it's great.
Oh my gosh, I got to go back and watch that episode or listen to that episode. That's amazing.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
he is a huge focal point for me, like on the lit review side of my dissertation. I did a lot of exploration right into his work and a lot of things that he brought forward. But one of the things that he talks about is, you know, we are the only mammals, right? As far as human beings are concerned, where we methodically and strategically figure out ways to kill one another, right? For reasons
How
that
many
are
years?
not
It's like that's
survival
like my
based or
job for like
political.
15.
Right? Like
Yeah.
that is. But if you look at the animal kingdom, like you don't really like there. It's a quick spat of survival, right? Or if it's a fight, like so, for example, two bucks that are fighting for dominance, right? They lock horns, right? Piranhas will flick their fins and their back tails at one another. When those bucks could gourd each other on the side, right? Those piranhas could bite each other, but they don't because it goes against species survival, right? And so
Mhm.
there are elements when it's a very extreme circumstance where that will happen, but not at the scale that we as human beings create, right? And kind of impose in the international community. So all that to be said, when you look at what happens, the meaning making process that is created amongst veterans, right? And what the mission is and what they are doing, man, that brotherhood, that sisterhood, it is damn near impossible to find that anywhere else, right, in the civilian world until the implementation of jujitsu and wide stream community, because the level of stress and also the level of close proximity that you have to your training partner, right? So like, for example, boxing, unless you and I get into a clinch, right, we're at distance, right? And we're
Mhm.
taking shots, giving shots, whatever. Jiu-jitsu, man, you are constantly in a sandwich, right? And it's small movements here and it's small movements there. And it's like the most vulnerable areas of my body are connected to the most vulnerable areas of your body, right? So it's kind of that thing where if you and I are standing chest to chest, and let's just say from a self-defense perspective, right? And what's the worst thing someone can do? Like they do the chest puffing and they throw their hands up in the air. What? You're exposing your neck, your diaphragm,
This
your
one.
stomach, your femoral. Yeah, exactly, right?
I
But
love
you
that
see
one.
it everywhere, and it's like it literally makes no sense why you're doing it right now.
Bro,
But
don't do
yes,
that. Hey, I bet that guy doesn't know how to
yeah,
fight. It
yeah,
works in grade A.
exactly.
It works in
Telltale
grade A.
sign.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we are now putting ourselves in these situations where, from an evolutionary perspective, right? I'm exposing areas I wouldn't typically expose. And so subconsciously, there's a blueprint that's being created that I can trust you. Right. So, like, yes, we're trying to get
Mm,
after it and we're trying to like stomp one another. But at the same time, I know that it's a chess game and you're not trying to actually kill me or hurt me. We're just trying to learn. Though, in the very beginning, right, emotions and pride and ego, those are all things, man, that have to get ironed out. And that is why jiu-jitsu has such a high attrition rate. Right? That's why a lot of people don't stick with it, because there's a lot of things internally that are misaligned that have to get realigned. And 90% of the time, what keeps people on the mat training is not the art itself, it's the people they're rolling with and they're training with. Very similar, right, to in the military. I'm not fighting, right, for the call. I'm fighting for the person to my left and to my right because I love them, right? And they're my brothers, they're my sisters, and I want to protect them, right? So it's very similar in that fashion of having the camaraderie that is fostered in the warrior ethos, and it's built around doing something, right, that has a very high stress element, very high adrenaline dump, cortisol dump, all that nine, right? And when that happens, it's very hard to mimic that going to, and no disrespect, of course, but like to CrossFit, right? Or going to something else where it's kind of independent and it's a singular thing. When you are taught and trained to work from an operational perspective as a group, right? Where one is none and two is one, well, to have that, you can't do jujitsu without somebody else. I can go hit a heavy bag, right? But I can't roll, right? It's different,
right.
right? And so it requires it. It demands that dependence, but that dependence is also predicated on trust, right? So, like, if you and I are rolling, Dave, and you put me in a rear naked choke, and we've been training partners for a couple years, dude, I know you're not going to hurt me, right? And I'm not going to hurt you, right? But at the same time, we're going to push each other. There's very
Mm-hmm.
few arts where you can do that with, and that's one of the very special things about jiu-jitsu. There's many others, but that's one of the biggest things from a meaning making perspective that really hits.
Mm. There's so much there to kind of get into, um, and just on like a personal anecdotal note, it's you're talking about like staying with it and that like kind of white belt mentality. That's something that
Hmm.
I forced myself into because I really decided I made the decision because my son wanted to get involved. He's 6, right? And he's loving it. And I'm like, okay,
Nice. Yeah.
when in my life am I going to be able to have a white belt moment with my son where we're at the exact same level?
Amazing.
Obviously, I'm much bigger, but
Yeah.
like he's
Yeah. Of
learning
course.
basically at the same rate. Like that is so rare. So that's been a
It's
big motivator for
special.
me. And yeah, it
Yes.
is. It's great. And he's always like, "Hey, Dad, I'm gonna get you a mount." And I'm like, "Yeah, let's do it, man." Like, and
I
so
love it.
it's
Love it.
cool. It's cool to see. Yeah, it's cool to see because with our gym, the kids program is enormous. It is so cool
Hmm.
to see just so many kids just wanting to get
Love it, man.
good at a combative sport because I think
Yeah.
we're missing that. And I'm glad you're talking about the veteran population. And I wanted to touch base on the model that you present in your paper, which is like the physical, mental, social model. And you were talking
Yes.
about the special forces guys in
Yes.
Colombia. They would go to
Hmm.
church,
Yes.
and so the first thing that came to mind is like, oh my god, like I don't know anybody that goes to church anymore here,
Hmm.
and we've kind of been ripped apart as a community here, and
Hmm.
Canada and the US are very similar in a lot of ways culturally.
Hmm.
So I was wondering if you could get into that a little bit more. Like you're talking about like the bonds you make at your gym. It's different than a CrossFit gym. You're literally like in tight, very intimate. You're sweating on each
Hmm.
other. You're
Yep.
farting. You're burping. Like you're
Yep.
getting like in your your buddy's
Oh yeah.
sweat. Like it's gross. But you finish and you're like, dude, that was sick. I had a great
Yes.
time. So
Yes.
where is jujitsu fitting in? Is it kind of fitting in as like our new, for those that take it seriously? And I've noticed this. It's almost, I'm not going to say it's a religion, But what I'm saying is that it fills a void. Is that part of what jiu-jitsu is doing? It's filling a void that, like Nietzsche said, like God is dead, but then what are we going to replace it with? Is this kind of what a lot of veterans are starting to replace their spiritual side with, and their community side with, which is jiu-jitsu?
So it's interesting, right? Because so there's a duality here, and you hit something that was very, very, very important, right? This idea of it becoming a religion, right? Some people call it a cult, right? Because you do hear that sort of talk, right, about jujitsu, and
Yeah.
um, but at the same token,
Well, as
when
soon
you
as you
break
flash the
down.
gang signs, I was just gonna say, as soon as they flash the gang sign, guys get guys like you, like, hey, bro, hey, like, cool, you got a pie, like, I'll get like people are like, hey, cool, I listen to your podcast. I'm like, oh, thanks, man. I guess I'm in the gang now. This is cool.
But I like okay, so but like legitimately, it's a real thing. Like because like whenever you start talking to two jujitsu guys, like, and they kind of figure out what camp they're a part of and the lineage and whatnot, it just creates this open camaraderie where it's like, oh, that's my dude. Like, yeah, I love that guy, right? But I met him once, but that's really I know that he trains, and I know where he trains out of. But that is absolutely a very real thing. But as far as what is being fostered and created, when you look at this, so there's a concept that was created back in the 40s by a French sociologist called Emily Durkheim. And what this is called is collective consciousness, right? And so what collective consciousness is whenever you have more than one person, right, and they're interacting and intertwining with somebody else, right, there is a consciousness that is formed where we don't have to talk. We can feel, right, what is going on between one another. And that is at a very rudimentary, fundamental, basic level. Now, add physical activity on top of that, that is physical activity with intent to do something, as in a submission or a pin, then it amplifies that, right? And that is an addicting thing because, and I talk about this in my book, which I forgot to mention it, but in the book, basically what I say is we live in a time of connected disconnection, right? So we are more connected with these things now, right? But internally, we are more disconnected than we've ever been because there's so much damn stimuli in our environment that we don't take the time to stop, right? And be able to take a step back, achieve an objective perspective, as very difficult to do, right? But what jujitsu forces you to do is cut everything out. You have got nothing to worry about in this very moment except for the guy who's trying to choke you. That's it, right? And our brains are wired and designed to not multitask. I don't care how good someone says they are at multitasking, your brain's not wired to multitask. We are focused and literally conditioned to focus on one thing at a time. And when we do it, it feels really good. It has a very fulfilling thing. And when we do it with another person, it feels really, really good because now we've done something together, right? There's a moment that you and I have shared that no one can ever take away from us, right? And so, as silly as
That's
that
not
may
that's not
sound,
that sounds very sensual.
it's powerful. Yeah. It's
God,
very
Doctor
powerful,
Doctor
right, man?
G,
Because
Doctor G. Oh boy, wow, you got me all hot and bothered, man. Man,
oh my gosh, Dave, I love it, dude. But it's a real thing in the sense that we're a tribal species, right? And so having that tribe that's forged in the sweat and the blood and the tears, and hey, listen, also injuries, right? Everyone knows that in this community, it's not a question of if, it's when, right? Injuries are
hmm
going to happen. Matter of fact, I'm still recovering. I've got a separated shoulder, right? That happened about 4 months ago from rolling, and it's just you accept it, right? And you just keep pushing through it, but that in of itself fosters strength. It pushes you, right, to get to another level of understanding within and what your capabilities are. So, sorry, I went on a tangent there. Let me circle back to your question as far as what's happening as far as the religious side and jiu-jitsu being a replacement. So, since the feeling of fulfillment, right, is something that jiu-jitsu can provide, right, as far as the individual, you look at what it is that a lot of different religions do for people, right? And what it does as far as meaning making and making their existence be a part of something bigger than them. And then it takes my ability and my need to make sense of something because that's what your brain wants to do. Your brain hates ambiguity, does not like it, right? It wants to make sense of its environment immediately. When there's things I can't understand or I did something where I look back retrospectively, I'm like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe I let that happen. I cannot believe I engaged this particular target or whatever the case may be. that will eat you up and gnaw at you over and over and over again, right? And so when you have something that you can turn that over to and just, you know what, I know it's not on me. Whatever it is that I believe in is going to absorb that and take care of it for me. Well, when I step into a jiu-jitsu academy and I start rolling, everything that I have been worried about that day goes away, right? And now I am focused on this one thing. So it allows my brain a reset and a reprieve to be able, right, to engage the next day with a better attitude, because also there's a neurohormonal perspective to all this. And it's not just the belief system, right? There's the biological side, the neuroscience side, which says, look, man, we have this thing called the HPA axis, right? Your hypothalamus, your pituitary, and your adrenal glands. And it is solely responsible, right, for that stress response system and dumping epinephrine, norepinephrine, cortisol, adrenaline, all that stuff. Well, I mean, Dave, you train, man. So, like, if I'm lifting weights, right, and I want to get gains, right, outside of my nutrition and my workouts, right, what is the most important thing for me to be able to get those
Rest,
gains? What would you
rest,
say?
rest,
Thank
rest,
you.
rest, rest.
100%. Rest, rest, rest. It's so important, right?
Especially
Like,
as older guys, rest.
dude, it's pivotal, right? And so, when do we do that with this thing? When do we stop and disengage the analytical, the critical thinking, and just let go and let it be, whatever that is? We don't. Truth of the matter, we don't. It's a rarity nowadays, and it goes back to connected disconnection because there's so much that's going on. So that's one of the things about jiu-jitsu, right? So it forces you to look within. It forces you to really dig deep from an intestinal fortitude perspective, and say, yeah, you know what? Last night I got tapped 15 different times. I didn't get one tap in. Am I going to show up the next day? Right? And it's a gut check, right? Because that's another thing. Like, there is always someone better. Like,
Mm.
and it will be that way for eternity, right? Like, I think of times that, I roll, with my instructor, and it's like, I feel like a kindergartner, right? And I've been doing this stuff for a while, and it's like, he's just plays with me, right? And I'm like, this is so disheartening. Golly, right? But it also gives you something to work towards, which is really cool.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so true, man. I get nervous, right? Like I imagine most guys do, like when it's time to grapple, like at the end of the coaching session. It's like, all right, and I'm like, oh crap! Like you get that little bump of adrenaline, like I might get hurt, but it's just like, all right, like I'm not gonna just like run away. Like I have got
You
hurt.
got to
Like I
do
think
it.
my finger's a bit mangled up. And one thing I noticed too,
Yeah.
the younger bucks, like I go the early class because it's mostly like dads, 40-year-olds, like
Yeah.
7 a.m. So most young guys are not getting up at like 6 in the morning to show up to
Sure.
jujitsu. So I
Yeah.
figured out a way to avoid the young guys because the young guys, I've rolled with them. Oh man, they're
Oh,
so
they go
fast.
hard,
They're so
man.
strong, and they
Yes.
go hard. They're
Yeah.
like, I'm gonna
Yes.
mess this dad up. Like I'm sure in the back of my mind, like
Yep.
this old man is going down. And so like my
Oh,
fingers got all
100%.
mangled up, my knee got all like jammed up, my hips were hurting for like 3 weeks, and I was just like, but I'm still gonna go. But I'm kind of cringing, like, don't hurt me. But that fear, overcoming that fear,
Oh,
puts me
yeah.
in a place where like I felt when I'd go on patrol, like I'd have this like
Hmm.
I guess this mammalian response, this fear response. I think you were talking about the hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal
Hmm.
axis, right? Like those things are fired up when you're in a war
Hmm.
setting, and you have to condition yourself and get yourself over that hump, or you just curl up in a ball and not be able to do what you had to do. So overcoming that
Hmm.
is really important. But then having that experience when you're back home is hard because there's nothing
Hmm.
really hard other than life, kids, work. Like that's the hard
Yeah.
now, but I don't really have to overcome any sort of fear. Well, maybe telling my wife I'm going to be home for dinner, like, but that's not like real fear, like I'm talking like
Right. Right.
deep rooted fear.
Yeah.
Like, but the combat is like a little micro dose of that. So, is
Hmm.
what you're suggesting that we need, and I'll speak specifically for veterans. Do veterans
Yeah.
specifically need to just? It's almost like getting a drug. They need another bump in order to like auto regulate and bring that whole axis back in alignment because we've been overstimulating it for so long that it's would it be safe to say that it's atrophied and that we need to kind of bring it back into check so we're not worried about those little, I'm going to say little, it's all relative,
Hmm.
things that bother us
Hmm.
during the day? Is that kind of the working theory here?
So it's an interesting analogy in the sense of the idea of the bump, right? And I want to piece that apart a little bit. When you take a look at the warrior ethos, right? And when you ingrain this identity of being a soldier, right? And you're serving your country and you are doing things that push you to go above and beyond what the average civilian could ever even possibly imagine, right? I mean, seeing things, doing things that your average Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, working in a cubicle individual, and no discredit to them, of course, but it's a different way to live life. It's a different day in and day out. It's a different perspective on the fragility of life as well. When you go and you have that taste and you commit months, years to doing that kind of work deployed, and you come back home and now you're expected to blend in. Now you're expected to be the Monday through Friday 8 to 5 guy, right? When you have a very clear and different understanding of this thing called life, right, and what's okay and what is not, it's very hard to let that go, right? Because it's ingrained in you because it's been baptized through combat. And there's no greater way to go through fire than literally life or death situations. And you are exposed to life or death situations every single day. Where most people in the civilian world in a first world country, things that stress us out are work deadlines or getting this email out to this person or, oh, I messed up that sales pitch. Or, when in reality, it's like, okay, like who's trying to blow us up? Who's shooting at us? Nobody, right? So when you step onto the mat, now you get a taste, right? And you get to reintroduce that warrior ethos again because now someone's trying to choke me. They're trying to hurt me combatively, and it's a different realm of combat because it's close quarter, empty hand combat. But nevertheless, it's this idea. There is this force that's trying to impose its will. I'm going to impose my will, right? And let's see where the kind of the chips fall. So you cannot get that, right, in a normal civilian setting. So jiu-jitsu provides a civilian-friendly institution that is socially accepted and is socially encouraged as a sport, but at the same token speaks to the spirit of the warrior ethos and allows you to continue building on that warrior identity just in a different way, and one that is productive as a civilian. And most people can understand because, oh, MMA, UFC, yeah, jiu-jitsu. It allows, right, for those connections to be built. And then also it opens up the freeway for communication between veterans and civilians alike. That's one of the biggest things, man, I will tell you in my research where the guys that I worked with had a really tough time connecting with civilians. And they're surrounded with them, right? I mean, they work with them all the time. And they're like, look, man, they haven't been through what I've been through. Like they just don't get it. They don't understand, right? But when I can take away that preconceived notion that they're not going to understand and now say, look, I don't even want you to talk to this guy. I just want you two to roll for the next 30 minutes. Man, it's amazing some of the magic that can happen in a relationship that can be created between the two of them just by doing that. Right. And so it's kind of like the old adage, right? You hear people say, like, the old school, like the best way to deal with conflict. Well, let's step outside and put our dukes up. And at the end of the day, we're both going to have bloody noses, but we'll shake our hands and we keep it moving. It's kind of similar. Right?
Shout out to my best friend Carlos, man. We smoked each other in the face when we were like 6 years old. Both had bloody noses. His brother was like egging us on. He's like, hit him. And we just baff. And we've been best friends ever since. Yeah, I totally.
But there's a bond, right? Like that's the thing, right? It creates a bond. And man, it's a powerful thing, and a lot of folks don't like to recognize it. But look, man, fighting is in our nature. There's a reason why it's called fight or flight, fight, flight, or freeze. Excuse me, right? But the fighting part, man, there's a reason why our species has survived, and we are ingrained to fight. It's there. There's no two ways about it.
A question on that note: do you feel that there is a concerted effort to dissociate ourselves from that truth of being human where we like to fight, or do you feel it's just a byproduct of our modernity and our comfort levels with life, because things are really good? Like, we don't need to engage in combat. It's easy. Like, we have everything at our fingertips. We don't need to fight for food. Or maybe it's a combination of both. Like, how do you see that? And especially for the veteran, right? When we come home, like it's shunned, right? The idea that we like to fight, and the idea we want to be in the fight, and we want to be downrange again, and like we want to engage an enemy. Like, these are things that are really antisocial things to talk about when you're not in a veteran space. So is it just that society just really doesn't get it, or you think there's forces that are trying to actively remove that from us so that we have maybe it's out of good faith. Maybe we want to have a less violent society so there's no war in the future. What's your take
Right.
on that?
So I definitely think that there are forces in play there. The reason why I say that is because we cannot escape the primality, right, of being human beings, right? Like there are primal things indoctrinated in us that are very necessary. And the idea that we can just turn our head to it and be like, well, let's just ignore that response. That response has been there for millions of years, right? To keep you alive, right? And to think that you're going to ignore that without considering the fact of just how fast things can change, how fast variables and dynamics can change in your own life, where you're going to want to have that response and be really dialed in and tuned into it. I always use this example, right? So, here in the States, what happened with Hurricane Katrina many years ago? Right. So like New Orleans went from a first world city to a third world city in less than 24 hours. Raping,
Mm-hmm.
looting, murders, all kinds of, right? And so this idea of I'm going to live in this box or this bubble and nothing bad is ever going to, I'm never going to have to fight. And fighting is barbaric. No. Right. And so we take so many things for granted in first world countries that we don't really dial into the fact of, wow, we have it good. But at the same time, man, it's a very fine line as far as how close and how quick we can turn into a society where we go back how it used to be, right? And so to take that for granted is a very, very dangerous thing. But I do believe that there is a movement, right, to want to water down those things because it makes it much easier when fear does become a thing, when violence does become a thing. A lot of people who've never been trained or conditioned, they don't know what to do, right? So that freeze element of right? Well, I mean, Dave, you know better than I do, man. Like milliseconds matter, right? And how you are going to stay calm in that process to be able to get yourself out safely and you're those that you love safely. You better be clear-headed, and that is a direct byproduct of having confidence, right? And you break down confidence;
Mm-hmm.
it's belief in yourself. Well, how do you gain that belief if you've never dialed into it? Right? You've never proven, you never validated it. You got to validate it, right? Which means you have to recognize it. So this idea of pushing it away, yeah, I definitely think, man, that there's something to be said about watering down that response, and to truly, it makes us weaker. I
Mm-hmm.
absolutely 110% believe that it makes us weaker as a species. I mean,
Yeah.
man, it's kind of similar to your shirt, right? Like what your shirt says, right? From Socrates right now,
Yeah.
right? And I can't see it from here, right? But I mean, that's probably something
Yeah.
worth
No.
bringing
No.
up
No man.
because.
Yeah. No man has a right to be an amateur in the matter of physical training. It's
Mhm.
something that I found once I started getting into the Stoics and reading the ancient philosophers. I was like, oh, I was like, they talked about all this shit before us. This isn't anything new. Like we're finding combative sports. They were doing wrestling. Like they knew like they had to stay fit. They knew they had to eat well. Nothing we're doing now is new. It's all been done before, and we were talking about
Thank
that
you.
before we went online. It's
Yes.
cyclical, and
Yes.
they knew from an early age you need to be trained in the combative arts. They trained
That's
all
right.
like if you just look at the Spartans, everyone was trained, and
That's right.
it's like Jordan Peterson's quote, right? I'm going to bastardize it, but like a good man is a dangerous man that has that like voluntarily under control. If you know
Exactly.
everybody is dangerous, you're not going to mess
Yes.
with the other dude at the mall. Like you're not going to get in
Exactly.
his face. You're going to have you're not going to call them out and cross that like invisible line because you have this
Exactly.
mutual understanding, and it makes things more peaceful within your own
Hmm.
community because everybody knows this guy's a savage. This guy's a savage. I
Hmm.
don't know what this guy can do, but he probably
Exactly.
can mess me up. And so
Yeah.
that physical nature of being strong and being capable makes things calmer. And I think that's been
Hmm.
totally lost in the last like 30, 40 years. So yeah, I'm glad he brought that up in that way, because
Hmm.
I think for a lot of us, and especially a kid from growing up in the 80s, right? I was like, don't watch violent TV, don't roughhouse outside. Constantly
Hmm.
telling you like, don't do that, it's wrong. Don't do that, it's wrong. Has an effect on a generation. So that's why I was
Hmm.
so keen on getting my son early on into jujitsu, so that he gets
Yeah.
aware of his body, that he understands like you
Yes.
can be physical, but there's a line, and don't cross that
Yes.
line. And if you do have to cross that line, you're capable. And so,
Exactly.
that's something that I wish I had when I was younger. So I want to give him that
Hmm.
gift now.
It's
So
invaluable, man. It's and I applaud you, right? Because that is being able to empower and give skills is so much more valuable than giving things, right? And so being
Oh yeah.
able to teach your son those, and then also lead by example. You're out there with them, right? Like I was telling you, that's special. That's a very, and he will forever cherish those memories and what it means to him. I remember to this day, man, when I started judo, my dad did it with me, right? And I have vivid memories, man, when I was 8, 9 years old, right, of watching him get thrown, watching him throw people, then him throw me. Like it's and it just me to this day, man. You're talking what 30 years ago, and it still brings a smile to my face, right? So
Yeah.
it's that's good. It's a very good thing.
Very good. One thing, the last thing I just want to touch on, I listened to a podcast
Yeah.
with you and TJ talking about We Defy, a nonprofit that you
Yes.
can describe a little bit better, because I'd love to get
Yeah.
this disseminated, especially to the Canadian listeners, because I don't think it's being done here in
Mhm.
Canada. And we're looking to you guys, the Americans, for inspiration on this. So I know it's not your organization, but I know
Mhm.
you're closely linked. What's that all
Yes.
about, and how is your research tied to this organization?
So let me just tell you, man, those guys are rock stars. I have a profound admiration, respect, and love for that organization because they, my research is one thing, but they're doing it right. Like they're actively out there helping veterans, changing veterans. I mean, for the better, right, and their families as well. So essentially, how We Defy works is this. So it's a group of folks that are all volunteers from across the country that have come together. They do fundraising events that essentially help to fund tuition for Brazilian Jiu Jitsu for a year for folks who've never trained Jiu Jitsu, right, as a civilian. So there's an application process, there's an interview process, and there's a vetting process as well, depending on where they live. And a We Defy ambassador will go and check out local gyms and kind of figure out which one's going to be in solid alignment, that will have a veteran friendly environment. Because I mean, that's the thing, right? Like, jujitsu now versus jujitsu 20 years ago, you have a whole lot more options. I mean, my gosh, man, 20 years ago, you were lucky if you found someone who was a purple belt, right? Like now, like there's
Wow.
black belts everywhere, right? So it's grown, right, which is great. But and as you know, man, like lineage and who you train under in jujitsu is a really big deal, right? Like, are they legit or are they not? How does it go back to the Gracies and then from the Gracies, right, up to a Jigoro Kano? So, but We Defy's mission is to go out and empower as many veterans as possible with a jiu-jitsu experience to encourage positive mental health outcomes and physical health outcomes as well. So I had the privileged opportunity to go to their annual gala a few months back and be their keynote speaker. And man, like when I tell you the energy was just electric, and to see like hundreds of people, celebrities included, that were there supporting the cause, it was such a special thing. So
Mhm.
yes, TJ is an incredible asset to them, and he and I we've talked for the past couple of years and just gone back and forth. And there's a few other gentlemen that are involved in the organization as well that are officers that are just fantastic and really committed and dedicated to being able to get as many veterans exposed in training and jiu-jitsu as they can. So obviously they use my research and my dissertation quite frequently to validate, right? So whenever they're
Right.
putting it out there, like, look, there's science behind this, right? This is real,
Mhm.
and that has helped push their mission forward quite a bit.
Okay. Awesome. So, uh, if you're listening to this and you're in the BJJ space and you're thinking, "Hey, I could probably get this started in Canada," now you know where the research is. Go forth and start getting this sorted out, so I can get some free tuition. This is my self-serving mission of the day. Get me some free jujitsu. That's all I want now. That's awesome, man. That's really cool. I'm seeing the change here. I'm literally privileged enough to have been given money from the VA to start a
That's awesome.
program for fitness
Very cool.
for female veterans here online. And so we're just scratching the surface, right? Ideally, we would have fitness for every veteran in Canada,
Yeah,
and then tie that into jujitsu and everything you just mentioned about how important it is.
love that.
Just getting yourself healed up at a emotional and biological level, and then also having that that aspect of community as well. It just seems like a no-brainer
Hmm.
for most of us to get involved in and to get training in the gyms. So I do have a question from a listener, but you know what? I'm going to ask
Yeah.
you offline. And
Okay.
if you don't mind, just because I know
Yeah.
we're short on time, because I wanted to just go into like, where can folks find you and start reading your stuff and looking at your paper, reading your book. You're all
Yeah.
over YouTube, you're all over socials. So where's the best place
Mhm.
to start getting into your research and your work?
Yes, I would tell you, if you just do a basic Google search, right, there's a bunch of different resources that are going to come up. A good place to start to understand the research and my perspective and my discipline would be the webpage for my book, which is www.sevenlayers.com. And on the seven side, so it's www.sevenlayers. The V is substituted with the actual number seven. So the book is called Seven Layers of Successful Relationships. And, just a quick plug in on that, right? So the premise of that book um, is this: it's the quality and depth of relationship that you have with yourself will always define the quality and depth of relationship you can have with other people. Right. And when you look at different modalities that exist and how you push the understanding of what your capabilities are, right? Truly, right? Not what society tells you, not what's been culturally conditioned, not any sort of, hegemonic influence, but truly within. That's where you need to start. And one of the things I have people do, Dave, and I talk about this in the book, is define yourself to yourself. Like when I had asked that quintessential question of who are you, right? And as esoteric and philosophical as that sounds, it's a very important question. And then if I give you a blank sheet of paper and give you 20 minutes and say, all right, write out your constitution, write out every single thing that, if I don't know nothing about you, write out every single thing that you stand for. And this is where jiu-jitsu really shines, right? Because jiu-jitsu teaches you very quickly what you're made of, right? So like, even if you've never, not in the veteran community, even just as a civilian, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
you're going to get pushed in ways that societally, day in, day out, you're not going to experience, right? But it's literally conflict every single time you hit the mat, right? And it forces you to be comfortable with the uncomfortable, which we as human beings, that's what we were designed to do, right? We just have
Mm.
forgotten that.
I love it, man. And I think this message that you're pushing here to the veteran community, it'll likely trickle down to all of us that have kids, and we'll get them involved, and we'll create that warrior ethos for the new generations. Because my my feeling is that we're part of this next greatest generation, because we spent 20 plus years
Hmm.
fighting wars, and a lot of us came back
Yes.
with no idea of like, what the hell just happened. We didn't have a purpose. There was no
Hmm.
victory.
Hmm.
And I think the
Hmm.
victory is going to come down to us creating the new politic, or the new generation of warriors, fighters, whatever we want to call it,
Hmm.
so that we can have a better, more fruitful and successful society moving forward. And I think jiu-jitsu is going to be an
Absolutely.
important part of that change.
Without a doubt.
So Gino, thanks so much for having a chat with me on the podcast, man. This has been a hoot. Like, I'll be honest, just scratch the surface here. Just like, we didn't even really get
Oh
into the
no, man.
science. I wanted to really like hit the HPA axis, but we got a lot of good insights into why jujitsu. If you're on the fence and you're listening, like, oh, should I do it? Okay, now you've got the science behind it. Now I think it's
Do
just
it.
time to take action. And yeah,
Yes.
you're talking to a guy. I'm 4 months in, and I was scared getting into it, and I'm still scared doing it, and I still show up to get humbled and
Hmm.
be a white belt, and to slowly progress and see the improvement, and to do it with my son has just been a real privilege and an honor, to be honest. So
Amazing, man. I love that.
Gino, yeah, thanks so much, man. And we'll have to do another one, man. You'll have to talk more on your research and dive in even a little deeper, man. I'd love to have you back on, so we can
Love
set
to.
that up on another day. And awesome. And folks, don't forget, train hard, fight easy. See you on the next one. Peace.